Hello, I am Tammy Marshall, and it's the beginning of July. Perfect time to be out riding your motorcycles if you have one. I do. I have a Harley. I'm not necessarily here promoting Harley. I'm here to read to you another chapter, two chapters actually, of my novel called Her Ride or Die, which is a mystery suspense, and it definitely involves motorcycles. If you haven't yet um, heard me read the first few chapters of this, feel free to go back and watch those videos. They're here on my YouTube channel. Here are this book and two others of mine behind me, and I have three other books. So feel free to check them all out if you'd like. But today I'm going to read to you two chapters, of Her Ride or Die. We're going to start with chapter 3, which is titled Let's Do the Abbreviated Version. To your first poker run, Joe said as he clinked water glasses with her. To winning my first poker run, she replied with a wink. He set down his glass. Well, you beat me at least, and that's all that matters for our bet. That pair of tens wasn't ever going to beat Bear's flush. That's for sure. She picked up the menu. Now to reap my rewards. He grinned at her, but didn't reach for a menu. Feeling his eyes upon her, she reddened and asked, Aren't you hungry? Starving, he answered. But I've eaten here a million times. I know the specials by heart. She cocked an eyebrow his way. Oh, really? Well, Mr. Smarty Pants, what is the Tuesday lunch special? A Reuben with potato salad and a side of seasonal fruit. It appears you've done your homework, young man. She waved her hand in a dismissive fashion. No detention for you this week. He laughed. That ride really did you good, didn't it? She lowered her menu. What do you mean? He fiddled with his now empty water glass. Well, just this morning you seemed really tense, and now you're really not. The waitress approached, refilled their glasses, and took their orders. Joe couldn't help but notice the appraising look the woman gave her before she left. A friend of yours? She asked Joe. He shrugged one shoulder. Sort of. He tore a corner off his paper napkin. We dated a couple of times. Josephine smiled weakly. Despite her undeniable attraction to him, Joe clearly was a player and probably not somebody she'd want to get involved with on more than a friendly basis. Being a school principal carried certain expectations outside the school building and into her personal life. And due to her recent motorcycle purchase, she already felt like she was riding on thin ice. Taking up with a handsome biker might tip the scales against her. Some of the tension she'd released during her 3 hour ride started to sneak its way back into her shoulders and neck. She rolled them in an attempt to ease the tension before it got an iron grip and worked its way up her neck to become one of her famous stress induced headaches. To get it out of the way, she asked, How old are you? And are you now dating anyone? Or are you married? He choked on the swig of water he was in the midst of taking. Wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, he answered, 39, and not at the moment, and not anymore. Then he tilted his head and smirked. You? She sighed. She'd brought it upon herself. 50, and not anymore either. Married, that is. I haven't dated anyone in forever. He raised the beer bottle that had just been placed in front of him by the waitress, who'd probably overheard her answer. Here's to being a not anymore. She raised her glass of tea. I'll drink to that. Setting his bottle down, he said, Let's do the abbreviated version. Married 8 years, no kids, love dogs, but don't have any at the moment. Own a small acreage just out of town. Work as a photographer when I can get the gigs I like, and as a plumber to pay the bills. He paused while she took it in. Your turn. She swallowed. Married for 10 years. Ex realized he was gay and left me for another man. One daughter who is all grown up and engaged to a guy I can at least learn to love. No pets. Work as a principal and a part time coach. He perked up noticeably at the gay ex husband part, but his interest seemingly was piqued even more by the coach information. He asked, What do you coach? You wouldn't believe me if I tell you. He leaned across the table with his hands clasped under his chin in mock anticipation. Try me. He batted his long lashes at her. She chuckled and rolled her eyes. Tennis. He blinked. Tennis? Really? See, I told you that you wouldn't believe me. No, no, I can totally see you in one of those little white skirts smacking the shit out of a bunch of balls. She narrowed her eyes at him. Oh, shut up. It's not like that at all. I coach the ladies at the senior center. He leaned back in his chair and looked taken aback. No shit. When she continued to regard him with a straight face, he said, That is totally cool. She shrugged. It beats sitting around knitting with them. How did you get involved with that? Their food appeared in front of them, and Josephine didn't even bother to look up at the woman Joe had briefly dated. My parents go there a lot, and I joined them a few times to play cards. It bothered me that there were all these vibrant old people sitting around letting themselves go to pot. Personally, I don't like to be idle for more than a few minutes at a time, so I offered to take some of the ladies to the park to play a game of tennis with them. A bunch of them jumped at the opportunity, but once we got there, it turned out that most of them didn't know how to play the game or had forgotten how. So you started to teach them, he finished for her. She nodded. It was fun, and they all wanted me to come back and do it again. So it's turned into a regular sort of thing once a month when the weather allows. We did meet a couple times over the winter at the YMCA, but we all prefer the outdoor courts and the fresh air. He chewed and swallowed. That's really great of you. She shrugged dismissively. It's a nice change of pace from the drama of dealing with teenagers. I don't have any tolerance for that beyond the regular school day hours. He laughed. I can only imagine. I don't think I could go back to high school anymore. Kids these days are beyond my comprehension. Sometimes they're beyond mine, too. She took a large bite of her burger. Sorry, I was trying to figure out the lighting. That was the end of chapter 3. Chapter 4 is titled It's Not That Kind of Bike. She was to remember those words. At the end of chapter 3, she said, Sometimes they're beyond mine, too. She was to remember those words a few days later while sitting across from one of her female seniors and the girl's mother, who seemed even more immature than her teenage daughter, if that were possible. Josephine patiently waited for the woman's tirade to cease, but after 10 minutes of the same vitriolic rant aimed at one of her best teachers, she interrupted. Mrs. Whitmore, as you well know, our policy is that if a student will not, as in refuses, to do her work, then she will come in and serve a detention with me to make up that work. Camille here has refused on numerous occasions to do her English essays, despite Mr. Gregor giving her extra time to complete them and still receive credit. Seeing that the woman was about to launch into another Mr. Gregor was ancient when I went to school here defenses once again, Josephine held up a cautioning hand and said, Mr. Gregor is one of our most experienced teachers on staff, and he, more than anybody else in this entire school, knows what makes a good essay. Are you going to tell me that your daughter will never have to write an essay for any other teacher in her entire life? She cocked her head and raised her eyebrows at the overly made up woman. Mrs. Whitmore huffed. Writing essays is a stupid expectation. What in the world does a person need to write such a thing after graduation? She crossed her arms and glared at Josephine. Whether or not she'll ever write another essay after, or if, and she paused significantly to let the effect of the word if sink in for both of the ladies on the other side of the desk, she graduates is irrelevant. It's about learning to organize one's thoughts and present them in an orderly fashion. It's about making oneself heard in such a way that others listen and take stock of what you have to say. Are you telling me that your daughter has nothing of value to share with the world? The woman looked at her daughter, and Joe could almost sense her pondering the question and wondering if her daughter did, in fact, have anything worthwhile in her brain to share with others. Finally, Mrs. Whitmore said in a much more subdued manner, Of course not. Camille is very smart. Josephine leaned back in her chair. Well, then, Perhaps she would care to prove that by putting some value on her schoolwork and showing both Mr. Gregor and me that she does have what it takes to pass his class and even to graduate from this high school. Frankly, if she doesn't decide to care about her schoolwork, then we won't care to give her a diploma. And that in itself will tell the real world that Camille doesn't care about anything, which in turn will make her undesirable as an employee. Mrs. Whitmore narrowed her eyes. Camille rolled hers. Then the girl said, "For God's sake, Mom, I'll serve the stupid detentions and write the essays. Can we please go now?" The mother stood. "Fine, but I want it on record that Mr. Gregor is too old to teach kids these days and that he should retire." Josephine stood and opened her office door for the pair. "I'll be sure to pass on your concern to Mr. Gregor personally." She gave the woman a pinched smile, and then, when they were out of sight, she lit a fruit scented candle to cover the stench of cigarette smoke that had drifted from Mrs. Whitmore's tight clothing to the far corners of Josephine's neat office. Her secretary, Janice, stuck her head in to see if she needed anything before leaving. Josephine told her that she didn't. And then Janice said that Mr. Gregor wanted to see her. Motioned for him to be shown in. The English teacher entered and sat in the chair that his nemesis had vacated moments ago. She noticed that his nose crinkled at the clear evidence of a smoke odor. He looked at her in a puzzled manner. She laughed. "Don't look at me. It was Camille's mother. They just left. Pretty sure she goes through a couple packs a day." He scoffed. "I saw her come in the front doors earlier, and I figured it had to do with me or my class. Thought I'd better stick around to see what her complaint is this time." He sat perfectly erect in his chair with one leg crossed primly over the other one and straightened his tie. "Well, for starters, John, she says you are too old to teach kids anymore. What do you have to say to that?" He shrugged. "I agree, but she's too immature to mother a child, so I guess that makes us even." Josephine laughed out loud. "Well put, John. Well put." Then she blew out the candle and rose. "Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Camille will either do the essays and yet pass your class, or she won't, and then she'll fail. Her mother clearly isn't doing anything to help the situation at home, and she's looking for somebody to blame her poor parenting skills on. Since she didn't like you as a teacher 20 years ago, you are her patsy for the moment." She moved toward the door. "In a few years, she'll blame somebody else for her daughter's problems." She grabbed her jacket from the coat rack. "I don't mean to be rude, and I appreciate you sticking around to see what the issue was, but I have a date with my bike, and we're burning daylight now." He waited for her to walk out of the door ahead of him. "I didn't know you were an exercise buff, Mrs. McFarley." "I'm not, Mr. Gregor. It's not that kind of bike." She slipped her arms into her jacket, the large Harley Davidson logo prevalent across the back of it. Unable to resist, she pivoted and saw him standing there, agape. She winked at him before turning around and heading toward the faculty parking lot. So this is a mystery suspense. Joe McFarley, is a high school principal in a small town on the edge of the Nebraska Sandhills. At the age of 50, she decides to fulfill her dream of owning a motorcycle. Her bike changes her life and takes her on an adventure she never could have seen coming. An eerie adventure where she truly must ride or die. Some of that is still coming ahead in this novel. I hope you'll get yourself a copy. It is available as an ebook also, or as this paperback. Come back later down the road. I'll have another chapter available for you to watch here on my YouTube channel. All my other books, I have 6 books total so far. Various of the first chapters are all available, so feel free to watch more of them and see if anything piques your interest.